Ambassador, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us on CNBC.
Glad to be with you.
First, on Iran, the State Department says discussions are ongoing, but gaps in these negotiations remain. Just how close are we to securing this deal, in your view?
Well, I think because of the determination of the Biden administration, its obsession really is the most accurate way to put it, to get back into the 2015 nuclear deal. I think we're very close. The issue is how much more Iran can squeeze out of the administration, and I think that's what's happening now. There are any number of reasons not to go back into the deal, but I think the White House is deaf to them.
Advocates say returning to the JCPOA is in the national security interests of the United States. They say sanctions relief is going to incentivize Iran to realign its behavior, but critics like yourself have long disagreed. What are the consequences if this goes ahead, in your view?
Well, I think the immediate consequence, obviously, will be the unfreezing of billions of dollars of Iranian assets, which will go back under their control with their discretion to spend it on their nuclear program, their support for international terrorism in the Middle East and beyond, and the relief from economic sanctions, which have had a punishing impact on the Iranian economy. It will allow the regime a lifeline, really. It's very unpopular inside Iran now, and it will give them considerable boost. This really is a decision that will harm not just the United States, but its key friends in the region, the Gulf Arab states, Israel, and pose a proliferation threat around the world. It's really a stunning mistake by the Biden administration.
Just elaborate on that for me, because as you say, the Biden administration will need to convince Israel and other wary US allies in the region, like the UAE, where I'm speaking to you today, that they'll be safer under a new Iran nuclear deal. How does he do that, given the scale of Iran's destabilizing activity in recent months and years in the Gulf states and elsewhere?
Well, I don't think he can convincingly. I think that this is getting back into this deal has become a kind of theological objective for the Biden administration. It's free from factual basis, and really, it's in the Gulf region itself where the Iranian terrorist threat is most manifest. That's not the place at the moment to worry about the nuclear threat, but the administration, the White House, is trying to compartmentalize the regime in Tehran into the bad nuclear part over here, which this deal will supposedly handle. And the other part over here that they're going to behave like a normal nation again. It just doesn't work like that. And the terrorist threat's an excellent example of it. And this is what the Gulf states worry about, what Israel worries about. And unfreezing those assets is going to empower Iran in ways it hasn't seen in the last 4 years.
So flip the narrative. How do we make this region safer in the absence of a deal?
Well, my view, which I've held for a long time, is that because the regime in Tehran is the principal threat to international peace and security, until the people of Iran get a chance to govern for themselves, I don't think it's going to change. I certainly wouldn't do anything that strengthens the regime, especially at a time of significant unpopularity. And this infusion of economic resources will do just that. And it will give the regime the ability to withstand the internal criticism and to turn the heat up internationally. We just this morning had the U.S. government identifying the attacks on its bases in Syria recently as coming from Iran-financed, Iran-armed Shia militia groups in Iraq. This is just one of many examples, not the least of which, as well as Iranian efforts to assassinate present and former U.S. government officials like yours truly. All at the same time, while the Biden administration is trying to negotiate its way back into the deal.
Ambassador, we know energy and national security are also intrinsically linked. Do you subscribe to the view that sanctions relief on Iran would help to alleviate domestic energy pressures and price pressures at home in the United States if we did see Iran being capable of exporting its long-held-up oil?
Well, I don't think it would have a significant effect compared to the easier way to help oil and natural gas supplies in the United States and worldwide, and that's for the Biden administration to allow permitting, to allow increased production here in the United States and in Canada to help find ways to export it more readily. We've got plenty of supply, and I think what people should really consider is the direction that Iran has taken to seek more Chinese investment in its oil infrastructure, to tie its oil exports more closely to China, its efforts to work together with Russia, also under international sanctions because of the invasion of Ukraine, to help form a kind of non-OPEC oil and gas cartel between Iran and Russia. That's the direction the country is going in. I don't think that kind of policy will alleviate the upward pressure on global oil and gas prices, that's for sure.
How alarmed are you by Iran's growing military and trade proximity to China and Russia? We know China is buying Iranian oil. Iranian military drones are reaching Russia as well. What's the impact for US national security long term?
Well, I think it's a threat to global security generally. I think Russia and China right now have an entente underway. It may not be a formal alliance. It may not be an axis yet, but they're covering each other. China's providing economic aid directly and indirectly to the Russians in their concern about the sanctions over Ukraine. I think China would expect Russia to do the same if it decided to go after Taiwan. And in the area where they have overlapping interests, they have Russia and Europe, China in the Indo-Pacific. In the Middle East, where they have overlapping interests, their preferred partner is Iran. So it's a kind of three-way arrangement that I do think has global implications, but certainly in the Middle East endangers every country other than Iran.
The current administration called Russia's growing ties with Iran a profound threat. So how do you see that relationship evolving into the future?
Well, I'm very worried the Iran-Russia relationship will grow closer. And, I think it just stands to reason that relieved from international sanctions, a richer, stronger Iran will grow closer to Russia. So it's a good example of how the Biden administration's policies are internally inconsistent. By helping free Iran from the economic sanctions, it makes it a better partner for Russia.
When it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, what's your own estimates on a timeline here? This has dragged on for months. Talks have been underway for years. How soon before pen is actually put to paper, in your view?
Well, it could come at any time. I think what's holding it up is Iran demanding more concessions. I think in Tehran, the general view is that they mishandled the negotiation. If they had only asked for more, they have gotten practically everything they've asked for. And they're trying to think of new things to ask at the last minute. And so it's really only limited by how ambitious they are. And the fact is the administration has released some of the pressure on the enforcement of sanctions. So we've heard some pretty amazing figures for total sales to China over the last 18 months. Iran is not as stressed by the sanctions as it used to be. All that said, I think I could see it in the next 30 days.
And as for the Europeans, how would you characterize their handling of these negotiations?
Well, I think it's been really a poor performance by our friends in the European Union for close to 20 years over this thing. They're not the allies that are most threatened by Iran. This is one of the amazing things. The Biden administration has said it wants to strengthen America's alliance relationships. I support that objective. But the allies of the United States that are most worried about Iran are not Germany, France, and Britain. They're the Gulf Arab states and Israel. And those are the countries that I'm afraid the U.S. is selling out here by not taking into account the Iranian regime's ultimate objectives to get hegemony across the Middle East.
I wanted to switch gears here and ask you about the situation in Iraq. Of course, you have been called an architect of the Iraq war, fair or not. Do you have a view on what's unfolding in Iraq right now? Some say it's on the cusp of civil war.
Well, certainly the latest pronouncements by Muqtada al-Sadr demonstrate a pretty fundamental instability. But the real threat inside Iran now, as has been the case for many years, is Iran through Qasem Soleimani before he met his early exit, trying to weld the various Shia militia groups into an Iraqi form of Hezbollah, to have Iran dominate the entire country, not just the Arab parts, but the Kurdish area in the north as well. And I think the failure here goes back over a decade to the first American withdrawal from Iraq. I think we've mishandled this very badly, but it's an example of the difficulty, not just in Iraq, of putting a stable government together, but the difficulties posed when a rogue regime like Iran is determined to destabilize governments that are hard enough to put together to begin with. So this is really, in my mind, it's a tragedy for the people of Iraq, but the source of the tragedy comes from Tehran.
How should the United States, as the most important foreign policy actor in this region, respond to the clashes that we've seen in Baghdad?
Well, I think the general point I would make is that the U.S. should not heed the calls of those who have said, since China is the existential threat of the 21st century, we should abandon our interest in Europe. Who cares whether Russia invades Ukraine? We should abandon our interest in the Middle East and focus only on China. I think the exact opposite is true for the reasons we've been discussing. This is a global environment we're dealing with here. Stability in the Middle East remains a key target for U.S. strategic interests and those of its friends and allies. And I think this should, what's going on now in Baghdad should strengthen our resolve not to go back into the Iran nuclear deal, not to do anything that empowers the regime in Tehran, to work together with our Arab friends and our Israeli friends to try and counter this menace, which is the real source of the instability we see in Baghdad.
On China, U.S. warships are now transiting the Taiwan Strait. Reports say President Biden is also preparing to announce what could be $1 billion arms sale to Taiwan. This, of course, follows Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Do you think it will deter China in any way?
Well, I think it's a step in the right direction, and I strongly supported Speaker Pelosi's visit. She's a Democrat, of course, but it was the right thing to do. I have long advocated, over 20 years now, full diplomatic recognition by the United States of the government on Taiwan. It's a state by any international law definition. I think strategic ambiguity has outlived its utility, and I think the real path to stability and peace in East Asia and Southeast Asia is to make it clear that Chinese belligerence is completely unacceptable.
How do you see the US-China relationship evolving from here as well, given this most recent provocation? Beijing clearly concerned about the US support for Pelosi's visit, perhaps not in the lead up to her visit, but in the aftermath. She seems to have come out on top here.
Yeah. Well, I think the Chinese are threatened by Taiwan. They're threatened by the idea that people can govern themselves. It's a thought that existed in Hong Kong for a number of years, too, until the government in Beijing crushed that idea in violation, by the way, of its international agreement with the United Kingdom. The future of Chinese-American relations are really in Chinese hands. We're content, I think, to try and work peacefully with Beijing. That doesn't seem to be their intent. I think if they wanted to do something constructive, one thing that would be very important would be to stop stealing the intellectual property of the United States, Japan, Europe, and others, something they've been doing for decades. Respect intellectual property and move in conformity with the international norms of doing business, which a lot of us thought they were going to do when they joined the World Trade Organization over 20 years ago, but which they have done the exact opposite of.
On the Mar-a-Lago investigation, former President Trump has requested a special master to oversee the case. When you look at this situation at a more broad level and from an international perspective, why should allies trust that the United States is a reliable national security partner when material of this nature is handled and forgotten in such a cavalier way?
Well, let me say, as a general proposition, it's not handled in a cavalier way. This is Donald Trump handling it. And I think governments, friendly governments and unfriendly governments around the world should recognize Trump is an aberration. He does not reflect long-term American interest. His behavior with respect to classified information has long been a great concern. We don't know exactly what damage may have occurred here. There's a damage assessment now underway. But I'd urge everybody really to let our legal process play out here. We don't know what the documents were. They may or may not be as sensitive as indicated. I'm not trying to downplay the risk, but I am trying to say that none of us are well informed enough to know exactly what was in the documents. That will come. Let's let the process play out.
It's absolutely fair to say that we are still waiting for the facts to emerge. And you write in a piece in The Hill just recently that there's still a lot that we don't know about this case. But as it stands, with what we do know, is it reasonable to expect that President Trump will face some kind of criminal prosecution here as a result?
Well, I think he's in jeopardy, but I think when you think in terms of indicting a former president, there is, let's be honest, the political different standard is if you're going to go after him, you better make absolutely sure you're going to get a conviction. And remember, in American justice, you have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a high standard. But look, I have said before, I don't think Donald Trump was fit to be president of the United States. This behavior, which we've been talking about, we don't know everything about it, but to me, it's just more evidence of that.
And as you say, this is a legal battle, but it's also a political battle, right? When you look at the situation, do you think Trump's stronghold on the Republican Party has helped or hindered the Democrats when it comes to their overall prospects in the midterms? Do you think this is going to basically charge the Trump base here? This could end up being quite politically advantageous for him.
Well, I think it is politically advantageous for Trump, and I think it's harmful to the Republican Party. The Democrats would love to talk about Donald Trump going into November. They certainly don't want to talk about the rate of inflation and the state of the economy. And I think that's very dangerous. I think Republicans need to focus on the issues that really confront the American people day to day. And if we do, then I remain optimistic about November. But if we're talking about Donald Trump by late October, Trump will love it. It'll be bad news for Republicans.
I thought it was interesting as well. You said Trump could be a kingmaker in the Republican nomination process just recently, but you believe he won't actually run in 2024. Is that correct?
Yes, I think Trump knows he lost in 2020. He will never say it because he's got a great con job going, but he knows he lost. He fears he will lose in 2024 more than anything else in life. He hates being called a loser. So he'll talk about running for a long time, but at the end, he'll find a pretext not to run. And as I say, try and be the dominant force in picking his successor. With Trump, you never can tell, and there's still a long time ahead. But I think his general position is such that he's much weaker than people think. He's much weaker within the Republican Party, except when he can say, I'm being picked on again by the Democrats, which is why this search warrant affair is a gift to him politically.
So who are you backing come 2024? I know it's still a while out, but any one individual firming up in terms of prospects in your view?
I think we're going to have a lot of very good candidates. I do not have a particular preference at the moment. I've been talking to a number of them. I'm generally very satisfied with the views of the Republican field as a whole in national security areas. And I'm optimistic about 2024. I don't think, while we're on the subject, that President Biden will run for re-election either. So I think we're going to have a very interesting political season and campaign ahead of us once the November congressional elections are behind us.
Ambassador, I appreciate the conversation today. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me.